Welcome to Made It with Connor Tompkins.
Everyone, Mike Lloyd is a post-exit founder. He's also a very successful entrepreneur. So he was able to exit his company for around 9 figures and is now launching a new venture. So I'm going to be jumping into his story with him. We're going to be talking about some stuff that makes us excited, as well as talking about what's coming around the corner next. So Mike, good to have you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Mike, I was looking at your background, and you started at the Virginia Military Institute. Then you went to MIT and you were like, I think entrepreneurship might be for me. And then Harvard was like the stop for your MBA before you're like full-time in founder mode. Can you kind of share that story with us?
Sure. So VMI, Virginia Military Institute, is a pretty unique school. It's similar to a military academy. However, you don't have to necessarily go into the service. It's more of an optional thing. And I was really drawn to that college experience because it's just very structured. It works well with my mind. I studied mechanical engineering, I played soccer, and just really enjoyed all of the great relationships that you basically get forged when you're going through something hard together. It was a great experience. And so from then, it really was this realization for me that I wanted to be a leader, but I didn't know necessarily what that meant and how to do it. VMI really, really talks about leadership. I mean, they have a leadership center, and they try to not only get into the theoretical side, but practically put people in situations where you have to lead. And so I went up to MIT to study mechanical engineering. And while I was there, I became way more obsessed with the tech startups that were all around versus the equations that I was learning every day. So I knew when I was there that I wanted to basically be an entrepreneur and go build businesses. And so I joined a company as an early joiner. I was probably the 110th employee at a fast growing marketing big data company. And then I knew I wanted to get some earlier stage experience and ultimately go to get an MBA. And I joined a Harvard Business School founders startup, and I was probably the 20th employee and the first product manager. And that was just an amazing experience, learning from them, watching what they do. And then I left that startup to go to HBS and do the MBA program. And I didn't even pay attention to any other options at HBS. It was just full on, I want to be an entrepreneur, raise venture capital, and go build a business. And that was the focus from the beginning.
I do feel like I'm curious because I think every entrepreneur is like, what if I had done more education? And then I see this course for entrepreneurship in these major universities. I'm like, what are they teaching in there? Because it's just kind of like a black box. And for me, entrepreneurship is so amorphous, right? You kind of figure out what you need in that moment and you make it happen. I don't know what structured education in that space looks like.
So for me, I mean, entrepreneurship is not necessarily a major, when it comes to HBS or, a lot of these business schools, at least that I'm familiar with. But there's obviously a group of people that choose that profession. And I actually think that the engineering background that I had was really helpful, because so many times you're looking at what seems to be an impossible problem, and you basically have to use the tools at your fingertips. And as an engineer, it tends to be, understanding of physics and equations to solve the problems. But as an entrepreneur, you're looking at, whatever the challenge is in front of you and using whatever tools you have and can get access to solve those problems. So it is this, just like fundamentally problem solving type approach that I was drawn to as an engineer and then obviously as an entrepreneur. And so for me, when it came to choosing electives at HBS, I basically just overloaded on anything that was building companies. And for me as somebody who never really had any, form of business background, I actually learned a lot in business school on the business side. I mean, I'd never seen an income statement before I showed up there. And so I had to learn a lot about the finance side of business and then, all of the, theory behind the marketing and sales and channels and all this stuff. So I actually really enjoyed the learning side where there are a lot of people who go to business school who already have a decent understanding of a lot of those concepts and are just going for a good time in the network, where I was going for, good time network as well as the school.
I felt like I almost had to learn from the people that I was hiring, which is a weird place to be in, right? Yeah. Because you hire someone and you're like, oh, this is how they structure their P&L. Or this is how they kind of like forecast things out and then report to the bank and try to get a loan. And you're kind of experiencing this alongside them in a weird way. Mm-hmm. And you're just trying to stay like maybe 1 or 2 steps ahead by doing research a little bit or spending a little bit more time than everybody else.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I really did learn a lot in business school that helped set me up to at least be dangerous. I definitely would not consider myself an expert in a lot of those subjects that many people become experts in, but I knew enough to be dangerous about pretty much every aspect of business, and just had to go from there.
For those who can't do HBS, do you have any key learnings that you think you can kind of pass along that people should look more into if they want to be an entrepreneur?
One would be just different books and, courses that you could take online, at the maven.com and these types of places. I would probably just look at the ones that are most subscribed to and highly viewed and greatest ratings, depending on whatever subject area you're most interested in. But honestly, even though I did have the formal education of the MBA, I too, just like you, learned so much on the job. And so I always am a big fan of, join a place. If you're not going to be the founder, or even if you are the founder, hire people around you like you did to learn. But if you're earlier in the journey and you want to be a joiner, join a place where you're going to get good access to the things that you want to learn about, whether it's fundraising or finance or these types of things. The smaller the company, the more you can touch on a lot of this stuff. But also at the same time, the smaller the company, the less opportunity there is for training. So you sort of have to learn on the fly and be fairly self-sufficient. So always trying to find the right balance, or where is there enough structure where you can get close to the action, but not necessarily have to, join a big company where you can't get too close to anything.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising whenever I worked inside a couple big companies whenever I was interning, and I was like, I can't believe that my specific job is a job inside of this company. My job was removing staples from paper so that way they could scan it and save on storage fees at Iron Mountain. That was my job. And I had like a cubicle and a computer I didn't use. But Mike, tell me about your first company that you actually started you were the founding member of.
I feel like I have to ask you a question first. What's the fastest, best way to get staples out of paper? Do you use the little device, or give me your expert opinion as somebody who was paid to do one thing only?
I'll tell you what I became an expert on. I was really fast at removing said staples, but then I was also very accurate. I had like a little target that I would try to hit with my staples, and then I would make art. This sounds really silly for this podcast. I made art out of the staples and the binder clippings. So I made like a T-Rex. I made like different sculptures.
Please tell me you still have one.
I don't still have one. I have pictures of what they look like. But I'll tell you one thing I did learn at KBR, which is the company I was working at in Houston, is I was an intern. I didn't really have a very meaningful job, but I did wander around like the 50-story building and got to know as many people as possible. And people didn't know which department I was a part of or who I reported to, but they were always open to talking to me. And I would just jot down details of the people that I met and what they were going through. And I could keep track of that stuff. And I used that whenever we were scaling Support Ninja and we were trying to manage 10, 100,000 employees and try to keep track of everything. So I kind of carried some of those things with me, and I still remove staples every now and then very well. So
you're a man of many talents. I heard a story once that Bill Clinton was also just an expert at keeping notes on everyone he met, and he obviously was a very just smart person on top of it, and so he could just pull from recall all of these details from many people that he met over the years. So it's an interesting. I've never done that, but it's something that I feel like is really good skill.
And I don't think it's disingenuous. I think it's you like genuinely being curious about people and then being intentional about the relationships that you have that might be more tertiary or more in passing. This is like one of those old school business books that doesn't go away because the lessons don't go away, really, is How to Win Friends and Influence People. Mm-hmm. Very popular book, but I think I read that at the right time whenever I was younger, and it just really stuck with me. Hey, podcast listeners, this podcast is brought to you by Pineview Insurance Group. When I sold my company, I wasn't really sure what I should be doing. I started buying a rental property, I started buying a car, and I didn't really know what I needed to do from an insurance standpoint. But that stuff is very, very important. Me and a lot of my founder friends, after selling a business, we have no idea what we should be doing insurance-wise, and that's where Pineview Insurance Groups comes in. So after selling his insurance company for $435 million, Mike Lloyd started this new company. I highly recommend it. It really does an audit on your assets and tells you what you should be investing in terms of insurance. So this is everything from your auto, your home, your umbrella policy, and much, much more. So if you guys are curious about working with an insurance group that's geared towards entrepreneurs, I recommend Pineview. You can get access to Pineview's new member waitlist at pvig.com/made it. Again, that's pvig.com/made it. Cheers, guys. But yes, tell me about the first company, Mike, that you launched.
I actually, after HBS, I started a company with all of the enthusiasm in the world, and it was ultimately a failure. And that was actually the step before the company that was ultimately successful called Corvus that we'll get to. But that first business right out of business school was also in insurance. And I did not know that much about insurance, but I thought that for sure with a lot of enthusiasm, we could build a great business. And I did a lot of things right, but I did a lot of things wrong. And unfortunately, some of the wrong things were pretty critical to the business and the customer acquisition cost. And it just didn't work. And so, I spent only about a year and a half on that business. I always say, if you're going to run a failed startup, try to minimize the amount of time you spend on it. I know it's sort of hard, easier said than done, but when the writing's on the wall and you're banging your head against the wall and you just feel like there's no way it will work, it's better to cut rather than just continue that sort of insane thinking of just banging your head against the wall. So that was actually the start of my venture-backed entrepreneurial journey, and it got me to love insurance. So that was in insurance, but a very different idea than what we currently end up building at Corvus. But it was a great crash course in insurance. I learned so much about the industry, why it works the way it does, and I learned that distribution, selling insurance, is very, very difficult. And that was what killed the first one. And frankly, we got a lot of things right on the second business, Corvus, on the distribution side, and got a little lucky too, like all successful startups.
I guess really quickly, what was the name of the first company? What was the structure? Was it you and a few guys? Did you raise capital around it? How did it wind down?
So it was called Poncho Insurance, like the poncho you put on.
Yeah.
And it was an online personal lines agency. And I actually started it in partnership with a pretty prolific venture firm called FJ Labs. So Fabrice Grinda and Jose Marin started this really prolific online marketplace and venture firm. And so I was working with them essentially as an EIR to build a business. And we identified insurance, specifically personal insurance, as a market to go after. And we, put a little team together, built some tech and started to get after it. But as you can imagine, your competition is essentially State Farm, Geico, Allstate, Liberty Mutual. I mean, you name the big brand and they all spend $1 billion a year on branding. You're basically trying to win essentially mind share from those brands and everything that they throw at it. So it was something where we had a lot of success whenever we got someone to engage because our process was great, but getting people to engage is very, very difficult in that market. And so I always joke in business school, you learn willingness to pay. And, a lot of business professionals learn this, like, okay, willingness to pay. How much are people willing to pay? Well, insurance, and especially on the personal side, I actually think that it's willingness to engage. That is the hard part. So many people just don't want to engage because they already have their insurance or they feel it's good or, they don't have a pain because insurance is one of the only products in the world that people pay for but don't want to use. So therefore, you don't really feel pain until you actually need to use it, which is very rare. And so because of all of that, it creates these really, really interesting human dynamics on the personal insurance side. And it was frankly one of the reasons that business didn't work. Willingness to engage was super, super, super low. And we were trying to catch people off cycle. So it's essentially when they're, not necessarily buying a house or a car or whatever it is, when people tend to think about insurance, because we were basically all about reviewing current policies, finding issues, and then fixing. And that's just a really hard business. The customer acquisition cost is very, very high for that type of a model. And so, we never really got to the point where we wanted to scale the business. It just, the math didn't work. And so we wound it down pretty quickly, again, after about a year of starting it.
You mentioned that you were working with FJ Labs on this, and FJ Labs has worked with countless companies. I don't know how many that they engage with. How did that help you with the launch as far as like resources that they provided, and were they supportive whenever you were kind of like winding the company down?
They were super supportive. Yeah, I'm still huge fans of FJ Labs and, still consider them good friends. They basically have done this so many times, and built companies. And one of the nice things about partnering with them is they know the game. And what I mean by that is, they're all in when it comes time to scale and make decisions, but they're also all in when the writing's on the wall. And so, they agreed with me that the business didn't have legs. And so although it's never fun to shut a business down, it was great that I had partners in the process that, understood that failure is part of what, unfortunately, taking these big early stage bets is about. So, they helped with all sorts of things at the beginning, from how to think through lawyers to product and tech setup. I mean, pretty much anything you needed help with, they have resources and advice on what to do. And then even just thinking from a board perspective, as the business was growing even slowly, what should we test? What should we think about? How can we get to that next step? And when we weren't going to go to the next step, they were very gracious in the whole experience.
It sounds like you had a pretty good, a year and a half to try an idea and see if it floats is relatively contained. I know some people that have been working on an idea for much longer than that. And because of sunk cost fallacy or a wide variety of different things, like you think you need to be more optimistic, or you think you need to believe in your idea even more, a lot of time is lost. And sometimes you just feel like the market pulls you whenever you have the right idea. And if you don't know what that feels like, then you can sometimes be stuck in a company for longer than it probably should be. But tell me about this pivot. So you then went to Corvus after, is that right?
That's right. So the decision was to shut Poncho down. And one of the things that I was trying to do at the end of that experience was basically sell the book and the technology, fire sale, just try to recoup as much of the investment as possible. And, it wasn't, neither were big or that significant. So it was more me just trying to do right by the investors rather than looking for, some graceful way of ending it, and obviously home for the employees. So I reached out actually to some local, I live in Boston. There's a local Boston insurance executive who's very active in the insurtech community, and his name was Phil Edmondson. So I was connected to Phil a couple months before all of this happened, and we had a nice conversation, but it wasn't that relevant. But when I was shutting the business down, I reached back out to him and said, "Hey, do you know anybody who may want to basically take the team in tech and book here?" And, it's a fire sale. I wasn't trying to hide it. And he was nice enough to meet with me. And we spent 58 minutes of our hour-long meeting talking about who I can connect with and meet with, and just talking about what worked and didn't. And then the last 2 minutes, he said, I've been thinking about starting a new business, and it would be really interesting to maybe do it with you, given your skill set and the experiences that you've had. We should talk about that. And of course, I was very much focused on shutting down the business gracefully. Of course, I was looking for something new to do. And I like the fact that this is a successful entrepreneur. He had just built and sold a large commercial insurance brokerage. And we basically started having conversations about his idea and what he wanted to do. And it just really grew on me when I loved insurance, but had a distribution problem. Phil, who's my co-founder at Corvus, basically had spent his entire career selling insurance. So he's a distribution pro, but he had never built a tech company before. And that's the only kind of company I've ever worked at. And so I just thought it was a really good match from the start to jump in. And I always think when you're thinking about co-founder relationships, you sort of want as little overlap as possible because there's just fewer ways to bump heads. We certainly had that, where I was really strong, he just didn't have a lot of experience. And where he was really strong, I frankly didn't have a lot of confidence and experience. So we were a great match right from the beginning. And he had already talked to Bain Capital Ventures about funding the venture. So Bain Capital Ventures and Phil basically had the capital to get us all going. And so that was also nice from my perspective. It was like, okay, we have capital, we have, good core team here. Let's do it. So it didn't take very long. I was actually, in fact, there was some overlap. I was still sort of disassembling desks and computers while I was, starting the new business that we called Corvus Insurance.
Hey guys, this episode of the Made It podcast is brought to you by our friends at Build, spelled BYLDD. Build is a development agency that specializes in helping early stage startups, especially non-technical founders and teams, build and launch scalable revenue generating software products. Most startups don't have $100K to hand over to a big agency, and honestly, for your first product, you probably shouldn't. Sure, you can try to roll the dice with some freelancers on Upwork, but that's a gamble with unclear costs and a lot of project management headaches and no guarantees. That's where Build comes in. For just $10K in about a month, Build can turn your validated idea into a product that's ready to go to market. It's a smart, efficient way to build a foundation for a company of any size. Their clients have gone on to be backed by Y Combinator and Google and have raised funding in the multi-million-dollar valuations. Ready to get started? Head over to build.com. Again, that's build, BYLDD.com. Connect with Ayush and let them know that you heard about Build on the Made It podcast. Cheers. The company that I started whenever I was younger, that we ended up selling for parts, I started working at Embark, which was a dog genetics company. And that company was doing really well while the other one was struggling to make it. And so it was, I think, because you were doing it in parallel, right? You were able to see like, oh, this has traction. This feels different, right? Versus this other one where you're like, there's like the go-to-market's harder. For us, it was more like the unit economics weren't there. Like we were leveraging partners that weren't making money, let alone how do we make money off that non-existent margin. With Corvus, were you guys focusing on cyber liability insurance, or were you guys focusing on a wide variety of different products?
Great question. At the very beginning, it was definitely multi-line, many different types of products in terms of the vision. But when we ultimately went to market, we launched with two different types of insurance products. One was a cargo insurance product and one was a cyber insurance product. And the cyber one, almost from day one, had product market fit and traction. And so it did take long for us to focus there.
That's a hard one, especially now. It's like the costs for cyber liability insurance are through the roof. I'm almost not sure if a startup can afford cyber liability insurance in a meaningful amount, probably in the next 5 or 10 years. So why do you think it was the right time where bigger vendors were asking for cyber liability insurance and then they like had to find a provider and they found Corvus? Like what was the path for them?
So when we were thinking about what types of insurance products to build, we looked at 4 different components. And frankly, the cyber insurance opportunity at the time was great and we were right. So one of the things we looked at, basically just looking at the market size in terms of not only how much of it is being sold today, because you don't want to go too small, but really how fast is it growing? And then also with that, basically look at the loss ratio characteristics. You don't necessarily want to be writing an insurance product that historically just runs really hot in terms of losses. So like auto insurance, workers' comp, like those products tend to have fairly high loss ratios. You can, of course, find pockets where you can make money from an underwriting perspective, but a lot of times, they're just structurally unprofitable. And we really wanted to find an insurance product that had, good loss ratio characteristics when you look across the whole thing. And cyber insurance had that at the time. And then it was also the fastest growing line. And you could sort of see the future in the sense of, this is just going to become more and more popular as more and more companies go digital and more hacks happen, et cetera, et cetera. So we were really excited about that. The second thing that was really important was we wanted to basically have a really interesting novel data set that we could use for underwriting. And one of the things that was basically a relatively new technology at the time was you can essentially see a lot about someone's cybersecurity posture from just looking at their public assets. You can't see everything. You can't even see a lot. You can see something. I sort of equate it to driving down the street and looking at 2 homes. From the street, you can sometimes tell which one takes their home more seriously and, is just better at maintenance and has a newer roof, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very similar to what you can do online where you can check a number of things just without permission, looking at a company's website. And so that was a relatively new technology that we jumped on and started to use for underwriting. The third thing that we looked at was regulatory environment. Some insurance products are really hard to get going. Others are a little easier. We'll get into the details, but cargo insurance is relatively unregulated, so it was sort of easy to get going. Cyber insurance, a lot of it is written in this non-admitted E&S world, which is also something that's easier to get going than has to be admitted product where you have to file it with all the states and all of these types of nerdy insurance things, but just harder to get going. And the last is distribution. So basically, are there a handful or hundreds or thousands of brokers you need to go to, or tens of thousands of brokers you need to get to in order to sell it? Cyber insurance was really interesting from the start.
Why did you not do general liability insurance?
General liability is definitely a category that we looked at. We really struggled with coming up with a data set that could really help us. I mean, we looked at large databases of lawsuits and try to find some sort of, correlation, causation, and try to look at these types of things. But there was never a data set that we found that really changed the game. It's just something where, maybe you could look at how much debt, in the UCC1 filings a company has to see if they're, willing to take more risks. So there are like different things that we messed with, but just like there's nothing ever that elegant around our ability to have an underwriting edge.
Right now, AI is a really big trend, and you're having access to more interesting data set. You can pull a pretty in-depth research on a person, a company, an instance. How do you think that's going to impact insurance?
I think there's a lot of ways it's going to impact insurance. Let me count that ways. But there's just from an underwriting perspective, you do need the data that you're looking at to be trustworthy. And it's part of the problem with some of the LLMs today is just like the risk of hallucination. And so, you basically go to a lot of these underwriters, and if you get some bad information, they throw it all out, right? And so I do think it's going to take some time before it gets really trusted by the underwriting teams. But this is something where obviously these things are only going to get better with time. And I do think that it will drive down the expense ratio, which is a pretty big cost for a lot of insurers over time. But I think it's going to take a little bit.
I was looking at the founders of a company called Whitebridge AI. They're doing like in-depth online reputation management and reports on individuals. And it's just interesting like how some of these companies are picking a niche and these founders are really doubling down. You can use it for like hiring data, possibly on the insurance side. It's interesting to see. And I'm also wondering what the impact is going to be on premium rates moving forward, or how you manage your online reputation moving forward, because you don't know what triggers are going to be pulled, right? So it's very interesting to kind of see how that plays out.
We really looked at that kind of data for EPLI, which is employer practices liability. It's basically, when a company gets sued because something not so great happens within the employee ranks. And so, it's something that, when you look at D&O and LI, like knowing who the people are and how shady they have been and can act is a really big indicator for those types of insurance coverage. So I actually think that that's a really interesting use case. And I think there's going to be more that type of data used in underwriting.
With Corvus, how did it scale? Did it kind of hit gold right away and you guys were like off to the races? Or was it more of like a steady build as you added on more brokers? And how did that work out?
It was definitely more on the side of hit gold right away. Which was just so wonderful given the experiences I've had in the past.
Yeah, compared to the last one, you're like, it's so good.
And a lot of it came down to some really good strategic decisions and hires in the early days when it came to distribution. So one of the benefits of working with Phil, and we hired a gentleman named Mike Corvus in the early days as well. And he still is with the company as the chief underwriting officer. And he was basically the head of sales and underwriting in the early days. And he just was so well respected in the cyber insurance industry that right off the bat, we had brokers take us seriously. And those relationships were not only helpful with basically getting brokers to pay attention to us and ideally push our product, but also for hiring. We were just able to really build an awesome underwriting team. And really for an underwriting organization like us that's focused on broker distribution, which we only sold through brokers, that underwriter-broker relationship is the key to unlocking sort of the next levels of growth and success. And so sort of right off the bat, we just had brokers that took us seriously. And when you get a broker that likes you and is good at his or her job and getting clients, just all day, every day, they're just coming back for more cyber insurance. And this is just how the brokers are, right? They like pushing the carriers and people that they trust, and we were able to do that from the beginning. And so, combination of hiring and being smart about where we went to market was definitely critical. But yeah, early on, it was pretty fast for the cyber product to grow.
Mike, this probably shows how little I understand about starting an insurance company, but I kind of imagine that you have a big pot of money somewhere that you use to pay out. How do you start something where you need to have a pretty good financial backing to support the product itself?
So there's a pretty common structure. You'll hear the acronym MGA or MGU. So that stands for Managing General Agent or Managing General Underwriter. Usually people mean the same thing when they say it, but if they say MGU, it's definitely somebody that they say has the pen, which is the ability to actually bind business. So the way to think about that, and this is a very, very common thing in the industry, it's a way for someone to basically become an underwriter, but not have to have a balance sheet. And so you basically rent or use somebody else's balance sheet in order to get going. And so you basically co-develop with them. Okay, this is what the box looks like. And as long as the risk fits in the box, we agree to how to price it. And then that sort of company that has the balance sheet will essentially take the risk. And so it's a very efficient way to get started with an underwriting operation. And so you basically go around to insurance companies or reinsurers, and there's all sorts of different ways to do that. But you're basically trying to get insurance capacity. And then you basically go to market under whatever brand, and you tell them that there's this backing behind you. And it's very, very common. There's lots of small ones and big ones, and most insurance startups start this way if they're underwriting.
I guess with your backer, did you give them a percentage of each premium that went through? What was the normal structure for something like that?
Obviously, lots of different ways it can be done, but the most common is a percentage of premium would go to us. They're the ones that are ultimately responsible for the claims. So a lion's share of the actual premium goes to them to sort of sit on the balance sheet. So when claims start to get paid, comes that way. So we would actually get paid a percentage, very similar to an online marketplace take rate for doing everything that we did, such as selling and underwriting and the different parts of the process that we managed. And then the other thing that's very typical is some sort of profit share. So essentially, if the business and book of business ends up being profitable, you as the one who went to get it gets usually some percentage of that profit.
Corvus grew pretty large. Did you guys have a backer the entire way, or at some point did you have enough revenue and enough premiums coming in that you were able to essentially be your own backer?
So we always leveraged third parties. At some point, we did create what's known as a captive, which is basically like an insurance company you can spin up pretty quickly for specific uses. So we did set up our own captive in very selective ways, took some risk, but that was never a big driver for us. Really, we always had third-party relationships. So we had many relationships when we ultimately sold the business, but the first relationship that we had on the cyber side was with us the whole time. So we never lost, that initial relationship, where sometimes you see that, right? A company will start and have one backer and then they somehow get burned and drop. That didn't happen with us. We had that one relationship the whole time, but we had to add a bunch just because, as we grew, that was actually the one of the most important things for us to manage the business was, do we have enough supply? Do we have enough insurance capacity to meet demand? It was a really hard, frankly, part of the business was to get that side. For a lot of reasons.
And insurance companies, candidly, is one of those things where in my head, I have a blocker where, like most companies, I'm like, oh yeah, I can kind of see how I could piece that together. Insurance companies, I instantly hit a wall and I'm like, nope, not my thing. I don't know how the pieces interact. So it's a very interesting space that you not only found yourself in, but you kind of got started in, right? Like this is like the main focus. You were able to scale to be a fairly large size. You grew it to over 250 million in annual premiums and you sold it. Do you want to share some of the details around like why did you decide to sell? Because you sold it to Travelers last year, right?
We never put the business for sale, but we were a venture capital backed, fast growing startup that knew that was likely where the business should go. Yeah. The question was obviously when and to whom. And so what ended up happening was after our Series C fundraise, we wanted to expand internationally. And so we did that a couple of different ways. But one of the things we wanted to do was launch a cyber insurance product in the EU. And so we were looking for that insurance capacity, that capital to basically back us. And we had a few different suitors to do that, but ultimately ended up going with Travelers. So Travelers offered us, I think it was 5 million of capacity, which is very, very, very small for such a big company and for what our ambitions were. But when we were basically going through the process, they just really impressed us. And I can say now that we impressed them, even though it was such a small deal. At the end of the experience, they essentially came to us and said, hey, we should explore a much bigger relationship. So instead of this $5 million EU thing, let's talk to the United States. And when they looked at their strategic initiatives and what they were trying to accomplish and, do you buy or build, looking at the different capabilities that we had and they were looking for, there was an immediate match right away. And so it took a long time. It took about 14 months from that conversation to sign definitive agreement. And there were all sorts of interesting meetings and conversations and whatnot in the middle. But ultimately, in November of 23, we signed that deal, and the deal closed the January 2nd of 2024.
Congratulations. Why do you think it took so long?
That's a good question. I'm not entirely sure, but my assumption is when you look at travelers, they don't necessarily buy a ton of companies. They're very selective, and they don't necessarily have what I would call like the very like honed process of, this is what we have to do to get a deal done. And so I think it took a little while to basically get all the different people on their side on the same page. And, we didn't put the company for sale. So we also didn't have some structured process that was forcing, a deadline. And so I think for those reasons, it just sort of just dragged out a bit.
But I'm happy that it went well. That's fantastic. And it's also recent, right? And you started a new company. So on this podcast, we interview mostly post-exit founders. And a lot of times whenever you sell a company, you have no idea what you're supposed to do next. You're kind of like, I guess I should invest some money. I guess I should talk to like a wealth manager. But there's not like a handbook that comes in the mail saying like, hey, congratulations, here's some things that you should do. I think about your new company, and I think that you're focusing on one of those areas that I think people who exit a business or kind of come into a windfall should probably look at. Why did you have this idea? Why is this the first company that you're kind of incubating post exit?
Having been in the insurance industry now for 10 plus years, and insurance, like we talked about earlier, is just one of those things that people don't like to think about. And a lot of people just get it and let it sit and frankly don't spend a lot of time on it. And so I saw this time and time again with my friends on the personal side. So people would buy their first house or, buy maybe their first nice car, or realize they're spending a lot on insurance and be like, hey, Mike, like what's going on with all this? And how should we think about our insurance? And I always say a lot of smart people do dumb things with their insurance. Like it's just really, really high performing, competent people. Sometimes I look at their insurance and it just blows my mind how bad the limits are, how sloppy it is. Like, hey, your spouse isn't even on your policy, like completely uninsured. There's just so many things like this that I see all the time. And remember, because most people don't ever realize that it's a problem because they don't have a claim or they never have a big claim. But insurance is, just something where you have to get it right before you need it. And then when you need it, you hope it's obviously there and good. And so basically, after having too many conversations with what I would consider very successful, smart people that are doing dumb things with their insurance, I was like, I need to start an agency that just focuses on these, highly competent, accomplished people and their families, and just help them with their insurance. And so at this point, started this company called Pine View Insurance Group, PVIG.com. And we are very much focused on, highly successful, high net worth, family office type people who basically are serious about life, but maybe haven't been serious about their insurance. And so what we do is we look at their current situation, their current insurance program. We do a pretty intense review, and then we go to our carriers and essentially fix it up. And that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to spend more money. In fact, a lot of times people will spend less for better coverage because they were very sort of irresponsible with their deductibles. They had $1,000 deductible on their house, but you don't want a $1,000 deductible on your house because if you put a claim in for $2,000, your insurance is going to go up, you could get canceled, and you are somebody who can afford to self-insure over, that $2,000 mark. So anyways, we basically optimize the entire insurance for people who are accomplished in their career, and we have a super high level of service. I always say, basically, we're building what the Four Seasons would build if they built an insurance agency. It's just like super high touch, a lot of care. This is not a numbers thing. This is a quality over quantity type thing. And I'm having a lot of fun building it.
I imagine that there's horror stories, right? Like things that you wouldn't imagine happen. Mm-hmm. I'm probably in the camp of I don't think about it as much as I should, considering, I guess, the different areas of liability, right? It's just something that you don't want to think about. You want to like put it on auto pay and then like kind of continue on. I do think it's important to almost do like an audit of some type. Is that and I think that's something that you guys are doing, right? Like you guys are talking to people, figuring out essentially what pieces they have on the board and how it lines up to make sense.
That's exactly right. Yeah, we basically do a pretty intense review, and intense not because it takes a lot of your time. In fact, for most people, all they have to do is just log into their current insurance account through this platform that we use, and it sends the copy of the policies over to us. We do a review, ask a handful of questions, and then can come back to you and say, hey, add your trust because your trust isn't listed, or add this person, or you have a really bad limit over here, or this carrier quality is not great. Whatever we find, we bring it back. And so, for us, it's just something where we think that there should be annual reviews and should be something that people have confidence that they have the right insurance. In fact, it's one of my favorite questions. Like, how confident are you that you have the right insurance, be it the limits, deductibles, and it? Very rarely do people say, yeah. So, so like, let's go, let's talk about it. But yeah, I mean, this is something where back to the willingness to engage, for the most part, you either need some sort of pull, like a conversation like this, or maybe like, okay, I'm going to engage on this because I think this could be interesting. Or you wait until there's a moment where you actually need insurance, be it you buy something new and you have to think about it. So for us, we're building this for the long term. We're in no rush. And so what we're trying to do is essentially build a wait list of people. And then whenever people are ready, we basically pull them off the wait list and engage with them at the right time. So, it's something where just by reaching out to us doesn't mean we're going to start hounding you and suck up a bunch of time. We're just going to wait patiently for whenever you need us, and we'll be on standby.
Is there other companies that you're planning on launching inside of this umbrella?
I haven't even talked about this externally just yet, but there is another company that I actually acquired and going to basically be retooling and launching. And I'm really excited about it because when I was thinking about what to do next, I always knew that this insurance agency idea has legs just because I've been in so many conversations where, again, people just need what we do. Even if they didn't realize it in the moment, eventually they would. So that was just sort of obvious to me. But I started really looking around at the insurance industry and areas that, from my perspective, just needed more time and attention. And I was looking at both Florida with hurricanes and California with wildfires.
Yeah.
And I started just looking at different technologies because I actually have less conviction around, how to underwrite those insurance policies better. But I do think that one of the big parts of the solution to both the hurricane and wildfire problem is risk mitigation or loss prevention. What can you do to the structure to basically protect it when it's under siege from the wildfire, from the hurricane? And so spent a lot of time basically looking at different technologies, and I found one in the wildfire space. And so I acquired this wildfire structure protection company, and I'm very soon going to announce that. And it basically, the rest of this year is going to be spending pretty much all of my professional time on both scaling this insurance agency called Pineview Insurance Group and this wildfire structure protection company, which by the time this podcast is released, I believe it will be alive and out of the bag. But I'm very excited about it because I basically bought the company before the LA wildfires.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so, it's really created even more of an acute awareness that this is a problem that we clearly have not solved as a nation. And the insurance industry, particularly in California, it was already in bad shape, and it's only going to get in worse shape. And so I'm just really excited to play my part in helping over there.
Yeah, I can see scenarios where it's like you need to have this or else it doesn't make sense to insure at all. I grew up in like Galveston, Houston area, and we would almost on an annual basis go help tear drywall out of like a neighbor's house, like it was that predictable. And with the wildfires, I think everyone's thinking like, what's to stop it from happening again? Is it a device that is it like a sprinkler that goes on the roof? Is it like a barricade that stops the fires from approaching the property? What's the mechanism that works here?
It is a full building fire blanket. But
okay.
when you think about a fire blanket, it usually is about basically putting a fire out that's underneath it because it suffocates the fire. This is about keeping the fire out. So although it's the best visual for what it is, basically putting an entire blanket over a house, it actually works in the opposite way, which is it essentially keeps the embers from, getting to the house, which embers start 90% plus of structure ignitions. It is a massive blanket that you put over the house, and it is so cool.
How do you even do this?
Just wait. I'm gonna raise a little bit of capital for this one, so let me know if you want to jump in and get on the journey. But I mean, this technology has been around for a long time. This isn't a new technology. So I bought this business that's been around for a long time that nobody knows about. We're going to scale it. And I'm convinced, because I've spent a lot of time looking at the alternatives, such as the sprinklers. It's hard to deploy, as you can imagine, but it's something that we've got a bunch of ideas and intellectual property that we're working on that's going to make it better, faster. I'm convinced that it's going to be a big part of the solution for the wildfire problem in the West.
How do you stick it on the house? Do you just do you have to get a crane on this to drop it on? Does it stay in the garage? Where do you store this?
You put it in the garage, and there's been a lot of intellectual property and patents around getting the right material that has the right heat characteristics to repel the embers, but is also light enough and strong enough to basically hold. It's this really sort of interesting thing you keep in the garage, and it's in many ways it's like an insurance policy, right? It's just something you have, and hopefully you never need it. Yeah. But when there's a wildfire in the distance and you're standing there with all your belongings in your house, if you can see the smoke in the distance and they're saying, hey, you need to prepare to evacuate, it's amazing what people will do to protect their home. There's a lot of other applications beyond just residential home for something like this that we're going to lean into as well. So I really hope that this is the beginning of a really sort of transformational moment for the insurance industry. And I'm going to do my best. I actually feel a personal obligation, to bring this to the world. After watching what happened in LA, I was talking to a gentleman just a few hours ago who his home was one of 3 that survived because he was basically in the Palisades, just like stomping out fires and running around and doing all this crazy stuff. And he sent me a drone video of the whole thing, and it's like all of the homes are burned except for his and one other. And I see these videos and I imagine what these people went through, and I just have to get this technology into the world aggressively, which is the real big goal here. And you can see how it couples nicely with the insurance agency, right? All these people are buying insurance, and we'll start to build these great risk mitigation, loss prevention services around the insurance agency and have them really play nicely together. So this is my future.
You're building like a insurance empire, one fire blanket house at a time.
I will send you the press release when it gets released here in the next couple of weeks that announces it.
But yeah, this is really exciting, and I like how it all links together. There's a very logical kind of connection there. You also put community and network building. How's that kind of piecing into this as far as things that get you excited?
So one of the fun things about the insurance agency is you sort of become in some ways a central node to a lot of interesting people. I mean, one minute I'm talking to an entrepreneur who had an exit in some, industry that I don't know well. The next you're talking to a medical doctor. And, as the network sort of grows, you just get to meet more and more interesting people. And I enjoy that. It's a very fun part of the work that I do. So, if I can meet somebody interesting and basically have write their errands and have the team at Pineview manage that and just build network, just good things happen when good people know good people. And so I view that a little bit as a fun byproduct, but in some ways maybe even the core product of what we're doing. So it's something where I just really enjoy meeting new people. And so if you're listening to this and you want to connect, find me on LinkedIn, and we'll make it happen. It's a great part and fun part of it all.
We will be adding a link to Pineview, so that way you guys can click on that link, and you can also find Mike on LinkedIn. We'll drop that link below as well. Mike, I appreciate the chat, and I'm looking forward to this episode getting out.
Me too. Thanks for having me.
Cheers, guys.
That wraps up today's episode. For more inspiring stories and valuable lessons from successful entrepreneurs, be sure to listen and subscribe wherever you get podcasts. Thanks for listening. Until next time, keep pushing boundaries and writing your next chapter.